Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner, and this is where we make investing fun, simple, and real. We have a great guest. Dan Wang is here, and he's got a great book. We're going to talk a little bit about China and what they're doing and their plans and really the force they've become in the world and how that affects investors. If you haven't done so yet, be sure to like and subscribe. Hit your notification bell so you know when new content's coming out. And also, make sure you make your way to get your free stuff at cashflowbonus.com. Always great resources there. Absolutely life-changing stuff. Help you develop the habits. There's knowledge and then there's habits, and we need both to be wealthy. With that, Dan, thanks for being on the program and doing the podcast for us. Welcome.
Hey, Andy. How you doing?
I'm great. This is going to be fine and a lot of fun. Let's talk a little bit about why. Well, first, let's give your background a little bit and where you come from, what you learned, and what brought you to decide to write Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future is the book.
Sure. I am a Canadian who has spent about equal amounts of my time living in the U.S. As well as in China. My folks are in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, for any listeners who may be over in from PA. And I spent quite a bit of time in China between 2017 to 2023 studying its technology development. I was a researcher at an investment research firm called GovCal Dragonomics. I was the technology analyst there, trying to figure out what's going on in China in terms of clean technology, semiconductors, drones, AI, you name it. And after 6 years of living through what felt like a pretty momentous period between the first trade war, the tech crackdowns, the entirety of zero COVID, which I experienced, I decided to move back to the U.S. to write this book. I was a fellow at the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. Now I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, thinking still about U.S., China, and technology.
So China is, when they say that's a big deal, I don't mean that figuratively. Literally, there's so many people. And they have such a different, they just have a different paradigm. You know, they can maintain the same leadership, the same regime for many, many years, where in the United States, the pendulum seems to swing back and forth between different types of ideologies, I suppose. But tell me a little bit about, first of all, what's the biggest thing? Why should people read this book? What's the biggest takeaway they're gonna gain from this read, or one of them?
Yeah, well, I think that the U.S. and China are at odds with each other, and I think that will not go away anytime soon. And I think that sort of competition will really define a lot of everyone's lives in the future. Now, President Trump might wish that he has the stability that Xi has enjoyed. Top leader Xi Jinping has been in office now for about 13 years, and maybe Trump wants that too. But the big idea that I present in my book is that I think we need to get beyond these 19th century political science terms like capitalist or socialist or autocratic to really understand these countries. The framework that I'm presenting in this book is that China is a country I call the engineering state, and the U.S. is the country that I call the lawyerly society. So to unpack that a little bit, I think that China's leadership at various points has been made up almost entirely of engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, hydraulic engineers, and they sort of treat the economy, the physical environment, and even society as a giant engineering exercise. And so they build a lot of homes and hyperscalers and bridges and roads. They also are very literal-minded about treating society as a social engineering exercise. Spend a lot of time with the one-child policy as well as zero COVID, which the numbers right there in the name. No ambiguity about what these sort of things mean. Let's take a look at the U.S. Aside from President Trump, most American presidents go to law school. Among our founding fathers, first 16 presidents from Washington to Lincoln, 13 of them were lawyers. Most of the founding fathers were lawyers. The Democratic Party is especially lawyerly. the issue with lawyers is that they block almost everything, good and bad. So you don't have stupid ideas like the one-child policy. You also don't have functional infrastructure almost anywhere.
Interesting. I have no data to prove this. It's just an intuition, and probably shouldn't even be a belief because I don't have any way to prove it. But I feel like culture is more powerful than policy. You mentioned in the United States we're lawyerly, and boy, isn't that the truth. When we don't like something, we simply say, well, there should be a law. I don't like this, and I don't like other people doing this, so we should make a law so this can't happen anymore. Or there's this equality there, or that inequality there. We got to fix these things with a law. Where I think culture, especially within my own family, I didn't raise my kids with rules. We kind of embraced standards, which is very different. We had cultural standards in our family, not rules that brought penalties or anything like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Tell me about the difference. Tell me about the difference in the culture. I mean, you mentioned they look at things from an engineering standpoint. We're going to create this. We're going to build this. What's the biggest cultural difference that we should know about?
I guess, I'm speaking to you now from San Francisco, where I spent a lot of time. And San Francisco, American big cities, New York, San Francisco, one way that this culture manifests is that these cities have mostly pretty bad infrastructure. They work well for the rich, but they don't work very well, I think, for the middle class. So, the rich in New York don't have to take the subway to work. They don't worry about housing unaffordability. They have these skinny skyscrapers. The rich in California are also able to make do, and they don't have to worry very much about, let's say, a lot of homeless folks who are the most unfortunate among us. By contrast, in China, you fly into the airport, the transportation is excellent. There's take the subway into the center of town. The cities are very neat and orderly. There's vibrant commercial areas in a way that you would find in New York, but you wouldn't find in San Francisco. And so, just this physical experience of going to Asia is already really stark and different. And I think there's no reason that the U.S. cannot have great infrastructure. We've built great infrastructure in the past, but I really hope that the government could do better for the middle class and all of the people who depend on these sort of things to go to work and to have a functional life.
So let's talk about, you said that, the United States and China are at odds with one another, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. They're certainly economic foes. There's just no question, and there's a lot of accusing of information on both sides. You're stealing this, and you're hacking this, you're stealing this. In the earlier in the 60s, I would say, you had this idea of Sputnik, and the Russian government launches a satellite. It's like, wow, this is a new world. They got a satellite, and now we've got them everywhere. But that launched a space race, and it's like, who's going to get to the moon first? It seemed like a big deal to, who could get there first. I think you can afford to lose the space race. I don't think, whoever plants the flag on the moon, there's not a lot of people there. But when you look at the race for AI and the fact that AI is fed by data and the fact that, China does not seem to value privacy and individuality as much. They're from what I gather, they're more of a group. And so their ability with that population to gather data in more aggressive ways to feed their AI. Can we talk a little bit about that space race or that AI race between the U.S. and China? What do you know about that? You mentioned, they're really looking to develop, the semiconductors they're using now are not the quality that maybe the U.S. has, but their software is figuring it out.
They're figuring it out with software. China and the U.S., I think the U.S. is definitely ahead in AI right now, but I think that lead is not necessarily going to last forever. So China does bring a lot of advantages to this race. For one thing, the data, as you mentioned, they have a lot of it. And In some cases, the privacy concerns are not quite there. China has a lot of talent. Even if we take a look at the high-end talent working at the frontier labs in San Francisco, a lot of the top researchers were trained in Chinese universities that American Silicon Valley firms have hired to be over here. And one other big Chinese advantage that it's able to bring is that China is able to build just a lot more power capacity, just a lot more electrical power capacity. And so the U.S. has a lot of power, but China generates twice as much electrical power as the U.S. Does, and it's a pretty significant difference. And on top of that, China is building a lot more. So, some two interesting bits of statistics here, of data here, are that by the end of this year, in 2025, China is on track to deploy about 500 gigawatts of solar power alone. The U.S. is on track to deploy 50. So that China's just doing 10 times more. There's 33 nuclear power plants under construction in China. There's 0 under construction in the U.S. And so President Trump wants to do a little bit more in terms of building more coal. But China's doing a lot more in the industries of the future: solar, wind, nuclear as well. And so I think the race in AI is very real. Right now, the U.S. is ahead, but China is rapidly catching up. China's not getting access to the top chips, but it seems like Trump also wants to sell some of the less top chips, but some of those chips to the Chinese. And, if we take a look at all of these other constraints on AI, namely power, China's doing a much better job at solving these constraints than the U.S. is.
You bring up a really important point with power. In the old days, well, I don't know if anything's old in the information age, since we're talking about, China's been around a long time, but in the old days, relatively speaking, you kind of had a hardware breakthrough, and then you'd build software to utilize the hardware. And then you'd have to have another hardware breakthrough, and there were limits, either software limits or hardware limits, and you'd push those two. But now I've heard this more than one time, is now there's a third bottleneck, which you mentioned is the grid, is energy, is that Facebook, Meta, Google, Microsoft, these guys are all building. They're actually looking to go nuclear. Think the scale of a small city just to power their AI. And it's interesting that it's so advanced now that there's a third bottleneck, because you never used to worry about plugging your computer into the wall and off we went. And the amount of power it takes, and also with quantum computing, that takes a lot of power. So it is an interesting space race. When there's a conflict, there's an old saying that says, "Don't choose a side in a conflict. Just sell the bullets to both sides." And as an investor, I hate to avoid it, or I hate to do it, but I can't avoid it. For example, when it comes to the Bitcoin trade, I says, all right, great. You have to buy my Apple phone. I have shares of Apple to check your Bitcoin. You have to have my Verizon wireless network to see what the price was. You have to own you have to go on my Coinbase when it goes up or down. You're using my Coinbase, and on and on and on and on and on. So I really like the gold rush approach that Levi Strauss took. Is let's not mind the gold, let's sell the blue jeans, the picks, and the shovels. What's the angle, if you put that lens on, how do you invest in China if you believe it's a thing? Because it doesn't really matter. I don't know that, well, I think it matters a little bit, but it matters less who wins this AI race, and more that whoever does win it, you've got some ownership as that technology is deployed. As the ability to find a job that AI can't do becomes just comparative advantage, right? Is it worth it's not ability if we can replace a job with technology, it's a matter of whether it's worth it. Is it cost effective to say, all right, no more order taker kiosk now, and we make that flip, and one by one they're all vulnerable to that. So as an investor, how does a person decide to position themselves in terms of China? I mean, how would you invest in China if you were going to?
Yeah, well, I think the first question is to determine whether you're going to. And I think that if you are an arms dealer, let's say if you're Lockheed Martin, I think the Department of Defense might have something to say if you try to sell bullets to the other side. So first of all, I think it is important to be aware of these risks because the U.S. government has in fact imposed plenty of sanctions on Chinese
Yeah.
companies that bar American investors from investing in them. But generally, I would think about the idea. If I were to invest in China, I would think about this idea that it is a big deal, which you and I both intend literally. There's a lot of consumers, even though China's population is shrinking year by year because of their demographic woes. There's still a lot of people reaching middle class status, buying a lot of things, buying all sorts of goods in the cities. Sometimes luxury goods. Maybe they don't buy baby diapers anymore. Maybe they buy adult diapers. I think by the end of this year, adult diaper sales will surpass baby diaper sales. It's kind of very strange, but those are like the sort of ideas that I would think about. That China is growing richer. That there are some investment opportunities in, let's say, consumption and consumer goods or healthcare goods that the U.S. government is unlikely to sanction. It's not about selling bullets to the other side. So, can you tap into the Chinese consumer growth story?
I haven't spent a tremendous time in that part of the world, but I've spent, I think, more than most people in the United States. And they're amazing countries. Singapore, I think, is the cleanest city I've ever been to, and you go into the airport in Malaysia, for example, and it's like their infrastructure is amazing. Japan, Taiwan is an interesting place. Does China, what happens with China's relationship with Taiwan? Because Taiwan, they can make chips there, and does China think that Taiwan belongs to them? Are they gonna pull a Ukraine and say, oh, this should be ours, or what do you think?
I think that
About Taiwan.
Beijing makes it absolutely clear that Taiwan does belong to them. Yeah. But I think that there's no clean timeline for saying we're going to actually enforce our laws over there. So the geopolitical situation right now is that the status quo of China saying that it wants Taiwan, the U.S. hinting that it will defend Taiwan through this doctrine called strategic ambiguity, and the Taiwanese completely ruling themselves, more or less. I think that status quo has persisted for most of the last 7 decades, and I think that there's good reason for it to persist. That there is no necessary timeline that Xi will order the troops from the People's Liberation Army and the Navy to seize Taiwan. The status quo is working quite fine because Beijing is hoping that one day the Taiwanese people will vote themselves back into the mainland. I think that's unlikely, but they can always hope for something like that. And maybe they can always hope that President Trump, being who he is, will just one day tie up Taiwan in a bow and then gift it to Xi for something that maybe they don't need to move. So I don't, the Taiwan risk is real. China wants Taiwan for sure, but it's not one of these things that is keeping me up at night over the next few years.
So there are some that would say, okay, the U.S. is lawyerly. That's a new word I need to learn how to spit out. Lawyerly, and maybe China's got an engineer mindset, and they're politicians, engineers. Some might just say they're thieves. Some might say that, well, they really don't innovate. They just steal the United States' technology, United States IP, and then make it their own and try to improve on that. Any truth to that?
There's absolutely truth that China conducts a lot of cyber hacking of the United States. I think that is also undeniable. But I would say that is not the main reason for China's success in all sorts of technology areas. The U.S. has moved a lot of manufacturing to China. Most well-known, the cases are Apple as well as Tesla. They're training Chinese workers to put together some of the best consumer electronics, as well as some of the best electric vehicles on the market. And the Chinese have a very competitive system in which I feel like, capitalism with Chinese characteristics is far more vibrant than a lot of American companies today. A lot of manufacturing companies in the US have really suffered over the last few years, namely companies like Intel. That's not mostly due to Chinese competition. That's its own missteps. Namely,
Yes.
companies like Boeing. Again, that's not Chinese competition, its own missteps. The Detroit automakers have been suffering now for decades. I think that's the statistic that I'm familiar with is that it takes something like 6 years for Detroit automakers to come up with a new car model and then actually release it to the consumers. It takes 6 years for these cars to be out on the road. In China, it takes about 18 months to 2 years. And that's not because, the Chinese have went to Detroit to hypnotize the executives to move slowly. The Chinese are really capitalist. They move really fast. And that is another potential reason if you were so inclined to buy some shares in the Chinese market, in which these companies are really competitive. They move faster than a lot of the rest of the world. And I'm bullish on Chinese workers as well as entrepreneurs over the longer run because they are really, really capable folks.
Really important, I think, for people to read this book, Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future, because they are the largest competitor and rising force in the world. There's no question. And I think we're already at economic war and certainly trade war for sure, if not currency war. It's a very important thing to keep your pulse on, because if they win the AI race, the almighty dollar rules in all countries. Money is everything to wherever you are in the world. It's money and power. And everyone will buy if they have the best AI and they discover the best stuff first, they'll be in the position to sell it to anybody who will buy it, and people will. What does that look like in the U.S. if China is declared the victor in AI? Do you see that as a big thing, or U.S. will catch up eventually?
Yeah. Well, it's not just AI, but in a lot of different products, China is already the victor in something like electric vehicles and something like a lot of consumer electronics. They're making better and better products of all sorts. Something like, even musical instruments, something like guitars and pianos. The Chinese are making better and better of, and so just generally, they are making better products across the board. And in something like AI, they have an open source approach in which their products, because they're chips constrained, they're optimizing more on the algorithms. In some ways, they seem to be cheaper than the US offerings. They're trying to globalize that much more to the rest of the world, to countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. And so I think that what I'm worried about is that the US still certainly has a lot of these big advantages, but in manufacturing, the US is really far behind. And I think that in these industries of the future, it's not clear to me that the Chinese are going to be very far behind in terms of a lot of products. I think it's certainly the case that the U.S. will still have an advantage in things like, financial power. It's certainly the case that they have a lot of advantages in diplomatic power, in things that include also biotech. The U.S. currently is in the lead, but China's catching up on all fronts, and so I think that is that should be worrying.
I'm gonna finalize with this idea and ask you a question about the another cultural question, since you were over there, boots on the ground. And my listeners will forgive me for constant basketball metaphors all the time, but that's I was the worst basketball player in the history of my school, and I can't seem to shake it. There's a little video that's circulating. It's semi-viral, I guess, in the youth sports circles of a college coach. And he says when they're trying to recruit kids, they say, are you hungry or do you just want something to eat? Because there's a difference. And there's some kids that are really, really hungry. Other kids just want something to eat. And there's a big difference that. And I think just the tone of it communicates what it is. And I went over to Vietnam, for example, and Vietnam is not like China because Vietnam is youthful. I mean, Vietnam, everyone's like 20 and 30 over there. They have a massive youth. But I could feel their hunger to want to compete, to want to become wealthy, to want to be very much like America as far as standard of living, and they're hungry. And I look at generation, I don't know if it's Z or Y, I can't keep track of which ones are millennials and which ones are Zs. I don't follow that stuff. But I just look at the youth. They don't seem hungry to me. They seem like they just want something to eat, and they kind of expect that something to eat just because they're existing. There's an entitlement mentality that is really interesting to watch from an old guy like me. When I grew up, I was hungry. And I look at these kids, I'm like, man, they got $300 Jordans and, they got cell phones and they live a pretty high lifestyle. I think they just want something to eat. Am I right when I say China's hungry and the United States just wants something to eat?
I think that there's plenty of people in China who just want something to eat. I think that's true too.
That's good to know.
There's plenty of youths who are quiet quitting on their own, and they're
Really?
tired of this, hyper competitive life. They don't want to. China has this phrase for work, 996. You work 9 a.m., 9 p.m., 6 days a week. So that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And plenty of people have opted out of that lifestyle. But there's also plenty of hungry kids. And I would say that's true of, a lot of the kids I know, certainly in the U.S. as well. And I'm speaking to you from Stanford University, plenty of hungry kids over here. And
Yeah.
now, I mean, I worry about a lot of Stanford kids because, you walk through the libraries, there's plenty of them who are just doing all of their work through ChatGPT. And then, when they need a break, they scroll through TikTok. And that's not good. The kids aren't necessarily very healthy or very hungry. But, still, I mean, we should recognize that Silicon Valley is the place that is generating these companies worth over $3 trillion, $4 trillion. That's completely unprecedented. And that is impressive in its own right. And there's plenty of kids in both the US and China who want to quiet quit. There's plenty of kids in both the US and China who are still pretty hungry.
Pretty interesting that anyone would dare talk about quiet quitting when AI can do their job in 2 years, but we'll see.
The motto of Silicon Valley still, going off of one of these whole earth catalogs is stay hungry, stay foolish. And so maybe that is a good message for all of us.
If it can be brought into practice and not just theory, right? The book that Dan Wang has written is Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. I do everything I can to keep my pulse on China. It's really a force, and it's one of those things that can affect our markets in a big way. I agree with you that there's just a person would be naive to think that China and the U.S. are not at odds, because they absolutely are. And it will be interesting to see how all of that plays out, given their stability and the flip-flopping of the U.S. opinion every 4 years or so. So it'll be interesting stuff. Dan, please hang out after I close the show so I can properly thank you. Hope you all have gleaned a lot of value from this focus on China. Read the book, pick it up, and learn more about this. If you're an investor, you want to know what's happening in the world and what your competitors are doing and how you might position yourself. And positioning comes from knowledge. So make sure you drop by Amazon, pick up Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And Dan, I thank you so much. You've been watching and listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, you can pick up your free stuff at cashflowbonus.com. We'll see you next time.